Do you remember falling in love? Not quite, no. Just so it happens. I pointed to the Times. Oh, you've even got the Times in it, like his dick wasn't out, you know?
And there was some feeling in England and by some producers in the United States that it was obscene. However, I think it's only obscene in the eyes of the beholder. And to me, it is not obscene.
Hello, and welcome to Revolution 2
through 8.
This is a podcast with the broad goal of covering everything and anything related to the Beatles. Tangentially related, tenuously related, anything we can think of. My name is Dylan. I'm one of your hosts, and with me as always
is your other host, Zach.
Now, on the previous episode of the podcast, we looked at The Beatles 1, which is a compilation album going over all of their number one hits and may or may not be a secret concept album. The jury's out. Now, before we get too far off the beaten track or off the Beatle track...
We're always going to be on the Beatles track. I don't know what you mean.
Before we go too crazy and start looking at artists that are explicitly not the Beatles, we figured it would be a good idea to give each of them their due, and we're going to look at each of them as solo artists for an album. Now, solo artist is sort of a generic term for not a Beatles album because they all had collaborators that they worked with. It's very rare that they are actually solo. To start us off in our solo adventure, we're going to look at the very first John Lennon solo project, which is a collaboration with his, at the time, acquaintance, secret girlfriend.
Yeah.
You know, they kind of kindled their relationship during the making of this album. This is Unfinished Music Volume 1, aka Two Virgins. Now, this is a record that we have some prior experience with.
Mm-hmm.
We listened to it for the first time about a year and a half ago.
Yep.
And this is a difficult one to pin down. If you're not familiar with the album, it's not music in a traditional sense. There are moments of melody and of musicality, but this is better described as a sound collage or an objet d'art. It's avant garde. Now, this as a genre of music, if we want to use that term, I think has always been very uncommercial.
Oh, yeah.
When I was looking up this record, and I apologize that I didn't write down a source for this, but I was attempting to see if there was an intended meaning, because sometimes with pieces like this that are a composition of sounds, there is a meaning or a feeling that the artist wants you to experience or to have in mind. That, as far as I can tell, isn't the case here. What you get out of it is whatever you make of it. It is open to your own interpretation and feelings.
I read on a Substack by a guy named Mike Press, that's from the articles called The Personal Legacy of John Yoko's First Experimental Album. He said, for Lennon, Two Virgins marked the beginning of his intentional break from the Beatles, challenging his own creative identity and expectation of his audience. For Ono, it's steeped in the flux ethos that album exemplified the idea of art was a process rather than a polished, finished product. I think that's a great way of looking at it, what Mike Press said, because this is just something to put out. It's kind of interesting to think about this album in a modern context, but not necessarily as an album, but as like our lives as content, because this is taken from the first night that they meet, and it's basically a bizarre like live stream of them just taking things that John had done with a friend of his for like over the past few weeks and then just putting it together. And I think as content that people would consume in like a live stream and like something, it's a very personal meeting, and everything we're hearing is like literally their first date in a sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to contextualize it and look at it. That's probably the best lens we can view it in as a modern audience. I want to correct or want to make clear that this isn't the first time that John and Yoko Ono met. They were acquainted previously. Paul met Yoko Ono first. The story goes that Paul was at his house. There was a ring at the doorbell, and this Japanese woman was there saying, "Hey, it's John Cage is having a birthday and he's doing this new art piece, and we're trying to get him some original manuscripts so he can use it in his work. And I'm wondering if you'd like to contribute any Beatles manuscripts to that end." And Paul said, "No, I don't think I want to part with any of those, but you know who might? John Lennon might. You should talk to him." Now, Yoko didn't follow up on that right away. They first met at one of Yoko's art exhibits, and she pretended to have never heard of the Beatles during that time. This was probably the longest that they had spent together. And as John said, after they recorded this album, they had sex. They made love. This was during the time that John was still married to his wife, Cynthia Lennon, with whom he had already had a child. This album was one of the factors that led to that partnership dissolving, and then John and Yoko being married shortly thereafter.
Can I have a quick disclaimer on this?
Go for it.
Even though in one, we litigated a little bit of some of John's like writing of where we talked about in Ticket to Ride, like some of his more kind of strange, just weird mental state that he is in his writing. We are not going to litigate him and his marriage stuff because I just don't find it all that interesting to litigate. It's been 60 years almost since this happened.
Yeah.
Like some of the articles I was reading where it's like, Julian was in the house when this happened.
Oh, really?
And that's weird. But this, John and Yoko, I'm not gonna ever diss them as an artistic or just that they love each other. I mean, we can tell it from here to Double Fantasy. These people are really into each other, and they never veer from not being into each other. Oh, yeah, let's just talk about it.
Okay.
One thing I think that also puts into think that this, what I said earlier with the Mike Press quote, that this was a break and to challenge your audience. I don't know how much of a challenge this was. The cover of this album, it was taken in Ringo's basement because that's where they were living at the time. Yoko and John are naked.
Uncensored.
In the initial discussions of this recording, I thought maybe we should talk about it, but there's not much to say. They're naked. The story about how, like, the printing of it, I think you might be able to add to that, like how there are issues with, like, I think only 5,000 copies.
I can touch on that. The album has two people fully nude on the cover with pretty much nothing else. I did see a quote from Ringo where when he was shown the cover by John, he was very shocked, and Ringo, always trying to add humor, was like, "Oh, you managed to get the Times in there," because there's a newspaper like on the floor at their feet. That's what he decided to comment on, and that's so Ringo. That's beautiful.
That is so Ringo. That is beautiful. I think Paul was like aghast by this.
Paul was like, I think he's like, well, at least it's not on a Beatles record, so I guess, sure, whatever. And, he contributed a quote for the back of the LP jacket as a sort of sign of goodwill. Yeah, so when John came and said, this is what the album cover is going to be, EMI, the publisher for everything that Apple Records was doing, said, no, we're not going to touch that. Absolutely not. And Capitol Records in the US also said, no, we're not going to touch that. Absolutely not. So the print run was limited and difficult. I don't quite know who they got to do it in the UK, but it was a very small print run. Only 5,000 copies were printed, and I think many of them didn't sell for a very long time. The album failed to chart in the UK, which, talking about an object like this and its, charting capability, that's not the right mindset to have. But if you're looking at it from the mind of the 1960s, okay, this is very nearly the first Beatles solo thing. George Harrison had a film soundtrack, but this is the first Lennon and McCartney without a McCartney. The Beatles were at the height of their career. They're just coming off of Sgt. Pepper. The fact that they could do anything and it be considered a quote-unquote failure is interesting.
Mm-hmm. I also liked this additional piece that I got about the packaging, where I have conflicting stories, so I'll give both of them. So one of the stories from Mike Press again was that no record plant agreed to package the album, so Beatles fans were hired to sleeve it by hand. And I also have other sources that said people that work at Apple were the ones that packaged it themselves.
like you said, it's been 60 years. Some of these facts can be difficult to parse.
Mm-hmm.
On the US side, the album was more successful, and they had a little bit better luck getting it published and pressed. Capitol Records wanted nothing to do with it, as we said, so they got their records put out on a label called Tetragrammaton Records. The only reason I bring that up is because that record label was co-owned by comedian Bill Cosby.
Wow.
Yes. Him and a couple of other folks that, frankly, I haven't heard of. But yes, Bill Cosby helped bring Two Virgins to America. It did better here. It did actually chart. It didn't break the top 100, and it came out on more formats over here. Whenever we listen to a record or a project for this podcast, we try to give it multiple pass-throughs. And I listen to this with my headphones. I listen to this on my hi-fi speakers I have here in my office, and I listen to this in my car. Now, you might be thinking, Dylan, this isn't really the type of music or the type of thing one would listen to in their car. My counter to that is they put this out on 8-track, which was the format used to listen to music in cars back in the 60s and 70s. So listening to Two Virgins in your car is perfectly cromulent and acceptable.
I listen to this only in two different formats. Most of the time I listen to albums are when I'm running, and then I listen to it on my computer. That is the only time I really listen to stuff, because that's how I do things. I will say the recording of this in your headphones is kind of obnoxious at times because of how it's channeled, where one side of the sound is on one side of your headphones and the other part of the sound is on the other. And I'm not very fond of that. So I think this was supposed to be a mono recording originally.
I'd like to take this opportunity to go over a little bit of the history of mono and stereo records, mostly to get it out of the way so we can reference back to it in future episodes.
Yeah.
I'm going to summarize a fair bit and leave out some details, but the gist of it is this. In the beginning, we had mono sound, monophonic sound. That means the sound only comes out of one place, one speaker. You can think of a microphone as an electronic ear, and it transcribes what it hears. But you only have the one microphone. You only have the one ear. So when it's reproducing things, it's basically coming out of one mouth. And that makes sense. Of course, we as people have two ears, most of us anyway, and so we hear in stereo. You know, humans and other creatures use that fact to kind of like we use depth perception with our vision. We can use it to kind of track where things are in physical space. Now, stereo as a sound recording format had existed prior to the 50s and 60s. They were first able to get stereo working in the cinema. They had stereo there, and early forms of surround sound were making their way there. But in a home format, it was all mono. Up until the early 1950s, you started to have some audiophiles experimenting with stereo sound. The affordability of reel-to-reel players and sort of 2-track and 4-track tapes in the home helped spur that along. Then in the 56, 57, during that time frame, the price of the stereo stylus or needle for your record player came down significantly. So that's what really opened the way for the masses to be able to experience stereo sound. Now, stereo would eventually take over, but it would take a little bit because people still had mono record players that worked just fine. And for the most part, they were backwards compatible. There were some differences, like if you were still playing old 78 RPM records, you wouldn't want to play one of the new Micro Groove LP discs on those machines. The needle was a lot thicker and it would tear up your records. During that time, you would have basically 4 versions of things that could be floating around. You could have a true mono mix, which is basically what had always existed. One microphone, one speaker, and that's how it was mixed and that's how it was intended. You would have true stereo, where the intent was always to have 2 speakers and you could hear things move in space. A good example of that is like the Cars song.
moving in stereo.
where you can hear his voice move from like left to right and right to left. And the Beatles experimented with that a little bit in like Revolution number 9. It's apparent as well. So those are like true stereo mixes where this was designed with the intent of stereo. But then you also had sort of like fake mono and fake stereo. So fake mono or fold down mono is where they just took the two stereo tracks and smushed them together to basically make something that would come out of one speaker, and you wouldn't get any of the tracking effects. This would be different from like a true mono mix because basically the levels might be adjusted a little bit differently and where you would hear things. And then you would also have fake stereo mixes. And the way that was commonly done is you might not have stereo sources to work from. So what you could do is copy the track, add a little bit of delay on it, put some echo on it, and then like what Capitol Records would do, as I understand it, is they would like raise the treble on one side and cut the bass on one side, and then do the reverse on the other side. Boost the bass, cut the treble. So you kind of had a stereo effect where, oh, well, I hear bass over here. Oh, I hear the guitars. Oh. And that you would kind of get both versions of that up until about 1968 when this record came out. 68 was really the year that mono mixes started to die. You were no longer expected to put out a mono version of your record.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this record was largely recorded in mono. Lennon had a stereo tape deck, professional tape deck that he was using, but most of the sources were a single microphone. So you weren't going to get a true stereoscopic effect. Like I said, that never stopped people from putting out stereo versions of records. Capitol was making fake stereo all the time. Because this was at the tail end of that era, initially some mono records were pressed. The story I read was that Lennon, or maybe it was one of the EMI producers, said, get that jazz out of here. We don't want it. We're going full stereo, baby. And so all of the mono records were to have been destroyed. But they weren't. I don't know how many exist out there. Might be like 50, might be 100. But there are a select few mono pressings of this album that are very rare items. They come up for auction every now and again. They sell for about $2,000, which is less than I thought it would be, if I'm perfectly honest. With Beatles records, there are some incredibly insane prices when you look at things like the Butcher album or, the first pressing of Please Please Me, certain pressings of Sgt. Pepper. It gets wild. By 1969, pretty much nobody was putting out mono records anymore. The only other thing I'll add is that there was a little bit of a difference between the US and the UK. The US killed mono records first, as I understand it, kind of by 67. They were pretty much not a thing. You had to like special order them.
Interesting.
So US mono pressings of albums like Sgt. Pepper are, I think, exceedingly rare, whereas in the UK they're maybe a little more common. The UK held on to mono for about a year longer, but by the 70s it was all stereo.
So were we listening to was like a faux stereo mix?
Pretty much, yeah. They did some trickery in the editing room to give it a stereo effect where perhaps there wouldn't otherwise, because there isn't a lot of tracking or what you might call full separation in this album. Mm-hmm. Usually if you're hearing something in the left channel, even if it's louder there, you're still hearing it to an extent in the right channel.
And if I'm correct, this is also something that is on the 2009 stereo Beatles albums, right?
So with the 2009 remasters, generally speaking, it was understood that the Beatles were more interested in the mono mixes, and they worked harder at them right up until 67, 68. That's when they got more interested in stereo. I've seen it cited that John really got into stereo with Good Morning, Good Morning, and all the Animals making their appearance, and they would come through different channels kind of individually. And then the White Album was the first album that they worked more, they put more time, and they were present for the stereo mix, and maybe they weren't as present for the mono mix. And then after that, you didn't have albums in mono. So yeah, with the earliest Beatles records, like Please Please Me, the stereo sometimes is more fakey. Like, I don't think there is a true stereo mix of Love Me Do, as I recall. It's, if you have a stereo mix of it, it's fake stereo. It's pretty much all mono. But I think even like by 64, Like you would usually have like the bass line in one ear, maybe like the hand claps in another ear. You know, they would put John and Paul in separate ears during the harmonies. So they would split things up.
And the reason I bring this up is that when we actually do the Beatles albums, there is going to be a lot of complaints from me about the 2009 remasters, because I threw a normal, like a stereo setup, like an actual like hi-fi setup, I think it's fine. Headphones, abysmal. But I even listened to some of the like a normal one came out of my shuffle, like a early Beatles song, I forget what it was, and I'm just like, I forgot how much I hate how this sounds on headphones. It is obnoxious, like how, like at times, like the drums will be in the left channel, then the times will be the drums will be in the right channel. But it's like one, so like you have like John singing, but then like they're in the right, and then you have them sing, like doing the harmonies in the left. And I really hate how that sounds on headphones, because like the sound is so close to you with headphones, but like
Right.
when you're listening to a stereo, it at least spreads out a little bit better and kind of collides with each other.
Yeah, with the Beatles tracks in particular, it was very intense separation once they started going all in on that.
Yeah, so moving on.
Let's talk about the musicality of this album. It's really difficult to categorize this for me. I personally don't have a tremendous amount of experience in this landscape. I've listened to this album. I've listened to other John Lennon solo albums that would fall into this category. I've listened to Revolution Number 9. I've listened to a little bit of Frank Zappa. That's about it. What about you? I think that you have more of a cultured taste than I do. At the very least, you expose yourself to more styles and artists than I think I do. So tell me what you know about this sphere.
Okay, so I do have experience with this field. I didn't know I had experience with this field. I did do some additional listening, and it has been, and weirdly, it has kind of improved my opinion of this album, of that I do like music that challenges me. I like art that challenges me. There were other things around this time that I knew of, like Can. I think it's going to be really pertinent when we go forward in Yoko Ono, like in her sound. I don't know who influences who, but there is a group called Can. They're a German group. They released an album in 1969 called Monster Movie, and they're in the krautrock scene. And there is definitely, when I hear like some of Yoko's stuff, she definitely has that krautrock sound. Also, speaking of Germans, one of Paul's favorite artists who released and had some early electronic music. I'm going to ask you to go for the title. By an artist named Karl-Heinz Stockhausen.
I think it says Gesang der Jüngling.
I would say this was something more you would be into, because it's more of classical music, but it has like electronic sound, which sounded very strange in like a classical music setting, which also leads us to the other part of Avante Garde that influenced a lot of like music I like, which is the Avante Garde jazz era of the mid to late 60s that heavily influenced a lot of the progressive rock music that I like. I would say an album I did do some research, because I was like, oh, I finally have a chance to do this, is Lou Reed's Metal Machine music. Because I just heard it's just basically a drone and noise album where there's very little different instrumentation. I don't know if you could handle it.
Okay.
Because it's an hour and 6 minutes of just loud, drony, as it says, Metal Machine music. He wanted it to be the ultimate guitar solo. I'm not sure if everyone listening to it will think that it's the greatest guitar solo of all time, but I liked it. And going back to the 60s, in 1969, year after Two Virgins was released, we're going to be talking about the album called Trout Mask Replica by Captain Beefheart and his magical band. But this album is kind of known for its production, in terms of that it is kind of weirdly mixed. The guitars are out of tune. A lot of the instrumentation just doesn't sound right. Like there's something annoying about the sound of this album.
Okay.
But because it just doesn't sound like you normally think it is, but it is still structured as music.
But it's kind of grating.
Yeah, unlike Two Virgins, which is very much just
very loose. Very demo-y.
Almost to the point where I'd say it's almost ambient more than anything else, or even a little drony, especially when Yoko comes in. But Trout Mask Replica is really interesting in terms of this is another thing that was pushing along people to think outside the box. And it feels like that was really influential during this period of time in terms of their production and what they had to put with lo-fi, which I wanted to bring up the lo-fi recording, because what we're going to talk.
It's very lo-fi.
Very, very lo-fi.
It has It has the same audio quality as you might get from bootlegs of John Lennon's home demo tapes, because this isn't altogether that different. It was recorded in the home that John Lennon was staying in at the time. It wasn't produced or mixed at Abbey Road Studios or another professional studio. I don't know what the term is for found footage for audio. I guess found audio or found tapes, but it's just it's just there.
This isn't a diss to the album. It's just showing how far technology has gone. I think anybody with a phone that has the ability to record could make something with higher fidelity.
From a audio quality and fidelity standpoint, I think you're exactly right. The tape loop aspects are perhaps a little more difficult to recreate in a digital modern setting, but you can get pretty close.
You could kind of do like sampling stuff where you just repeat samples and just mess with the samples, right?
Pretty much, yeah. And then you could speed it up and speed it down by a certain percentage to kind of simulate, adjusting the tape speed.
Brian Eno and David Byrne worked on an album in '81 called My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, where that whole album, they just make really decent little like funk grooves, but it's just all samples.
Which is not dissimilar to a couple of the segments of this album. Doesn't really have tracks. It says it does. It apparently separates it into like 5 tracks per side, but if you have the vinyl record, it's just a constant singular groove, and and on Spotify it's just side 1 and side 2.
Interruption. One thing I want our listeners to think about, especially if you're younger, is how weird it is that there are some albums that are actually experienced by the flipping of the record actually does affect like what some artists are going for. But it is really weird for these longer pieces at times that feel like they flow into each other. Like I think about this with Supper's Ready, a Genesis song, which is like 24 minutes long, and you have to flip it over like halfway through. How weird that is now in terms of as a listener, but I don't know if a lot.
It did come up. I did have the thought while listening to this, if John and Yoko weren't limited by the physical limitations of the vinyl record medium, I wonder how long of a recording they would have attempted to publish.
You're so true. Oh, yeah. But in terms of this album, the big thing in the beginning of this is the bird. Like that bird.
That's the most prominent aspect of the first side. There's a bird that loops and plays at different speeds and pitches, because when you speed up or slow down a tape loop, that directly influences the pitch. You couldn't really very easily make something faster or slower and have it retain its original pitch. So that becomes a central aspect. Another part that comes through about halfway through side 1 is you hear a very slow and low sort of guitar picking thing. And I believe what that is revealed to be once it speeds up and once we get towards the end of side 1 is that's basically an early form of sampling. John or Yoko, one of them, put an old 78 on the turntable and played it and utilized it as part of their music. They do that for a couple times. They do that on side 2 as well. And back then, sampling wasn't really a thing. So I don't know how the credits and the licensing works for that with sort of reissues that have occurred in the 90s and in modern day. The good news is that the track on side B, at least, is in the public domain in the US. Side A isn't yet, but it will be soon.
Fingers crossed for a super deluxe version where we get to hear all of the demos. Come on, Apple. Stop being cowards. Give us the super deluxe version of
Unfinished Music Volume 1, Director's Cut, 4 hours.
Or maybe they should just do that for all 3 of the albums. Just put them together. Just give a super deluxe of all 3 of those albums.
They could do a box set like that. I think that would probably be the best way.
No, that's not making enough money. I apologize. That's a pro consumer.
As you kind of said, you have an easier time with music like this than I do.
Yeah.
I'm going to come right out and say it. I don't get it. This isn't for me. I don't enjoy this. I was reading on the Steve Hoffman music forums, people discussing this album, and the people who cared to take part in that conversation, it seemed to be a fairly even split of people who are like, no, I genuinely enjoy this. I think for some of the same reasons that you state, that it's challenging, or that because it's such a intriguing glimpse into their life at the time. But you've got plenty of people who said, you know, oh, never listened to it, never planned to, or yeah, I listened to it once, that was a mistake.
I think there was an interesting quote taken from that Mike Press article again.
Okay.
That this is a quote from Yoko that said, it's talking about her son. Sean has such energy, which is interesting. John was a bit more emotional. Both John and I come from an emotional, romantic age, shall we say. And I think that this generation, Sean's generation, his friends are more sort of mathematical. They can think about it from the point of view of trying to make it into something. We didn't try to make it into something. We just did it. That's the difference, I think.
I think that's probably as accurate as anything. They just made this, and they put it out for the world to see, and they were able to make a statement with, you know, their nudity, with their nakedness at the same time.
Yeah, it's raw. One other thing I'll say is John's after my own heart. He made something in a night and didn't really do much else with it. I'm a lazy person myself. I'm not saying John's lazy, but I like that he just said, one take, all right, boom, let's do it. I was talking about them doing each other, not saying let's just put it out, but saying they did each other in the morning. But I do want to talk about this from a bizarre, you're separating yourself from money. One thing that I think that younger listeners may not get, that I think is really, that I often forget too. I forget that there is an era where I had to go buy album, or else someone would have to borrow me the album so I could listen to it, or I go to the library and burn it to my computer. One thing about this album that I think is interesting is that what if you bought it? And I think about, because we like video games. I once bought a game called Naruto Ninja Council for my GBA, and it was awful. It was one of the worst games I've ever played, and it wasted my money. And I thought, this was a waste of my time. Why did I buy it? But I do think about that. Like, were people upset if they did buy it, where they felt like they were swindled?
I think probably.
Yeah. I think that's how a lot of people would rightfully feel. Not a lot of people who are, especially, we have to remember, the Beatles were bigger than Jesus.
And there weren't online reviews that you could read during this time. You had to have a subscription to
a newsletter,
to somebody, to Billboard, or somebody that reviewed music. You would have had to heard from someone that this is not something that you'd want to listen to. This is not like cool new John songs. This is weird psychobabble.
And I even in some of the articles I read, that some people are like, "Oh, John's not hot." Like, like this ruins my vision of hot John.
I don't know if it's true, but I read that EMI, they said, oh, the nudity, we can't have that. Somebody at EMI allegedly said, can't we get Paul to do it? He's much better looking.
That's pretty good. And I think that this is like literally the emperor has no clothes. This is John openly exposing himself to the world, revealing, I am John Lennon. I am not John Lennon of the Beatles. I am John Lennon. That's an overstatement of what this is. But I do think John at that point was creatively stuck. He wanted to leave. And he's like, what is the most un-John Lennon thing to do? Release an album that I am barely on. And I swear.
He does. He says it towards the end of side 1, John drops an F-bomb. And I was curious if this was the first F-bomb in recorded music. I figured it wasn't. I couldn't really get a great answer to that question, but I can say with certainty that this is very early for that kind of language on a record that was sold in stores and that was present intentionally. I think the soundtrack to the Broadway musical Hair had come out prior to this, or it would be, contemporary. And that's probably the most successful early use of that word. You could argue that, well, nobody listened to the record anyway, so nobody was going to be offended by it. There's nudity on the record, art to be offended by instead. Let's focus on that. Maybe that's true.
Mm-hmm. I think another thing that John is that I think he genuinely thought this was fun and kind of liked this explorative music space and kind of wanted people to get hip to it. I mean, that they had to argue to get Revolution number 9 on the White Album. And I like that song quite a bit.
I was a little surprised to learn that this and Revolution 9 were not, technically speaking, the Beatles' first foray into the avant-garde genre. There is a piece of essentially lost media of the Beatles.
Interruption. There's a piece of lost media on this too as well, where we would get to see John Lennon jung for 45 minutes.
There's a lost movie. There's lost audio. To say it's lost is not entirely accurate. Paul has the tapes of Carnival of Light, and I'm sure Yoko has the tapes of John's junk, and maybe when she passes, it'll be released. Probably not. I would be surprised. I'm not going to go into the full story of Carnival Light in the hopes that it does get released someday, but during the recording of Sgt. Pepper, Paul was sort of commissioned or asked or volunteered to make a piece for a light show, basically a rave. And they took 15 minutes and they just basically ran around the studio and made a bunch of random noises. And that was the soundtrack to this visual experience. It played on a loop. It wasn't really advertised as even being the Beatles, so the people who listened to it might not have even known they were listening to a rare Beatles track, and it's never been released. It was perhaps going to be on anthology. Hopefully, maybe someday it gets re-released as they're going through the Beatles back catalog. I think a lot of people are really hoping for that. It's kind of like the white whale of Beatles recordings, I think, that's left. Fingers crossed.
But yeah, this album is, like, musically, I think we've said all that needs to be said about the two tracks. I think what this is, it's just an experience. It's a piece of art. You don't have to like it. You don't have to listen to it. It's an interesting part of the John journey. As I think one of the things I was reading said, we don't really get a lot of John and Yoko albums that are credited to both of them. And what starts us our journey all the way to Double Fantasy, which I love Double Fantasy. I think it's great. There is one more song to talk about that isn't on the album, but it is on the CD release.
Yes. As a bonus track, we got Remember Love, which was originally the B-side to John's first solo single, Give Peace a Chance. As I've stated before, I don't care for Two Virgins. And in the context of listening to that album and then this song coming on directly afterwards, it's like a tonic. It's like a cure for my ears. Having said that, listening to it on its own, outside of the context of having just listened to a avant-garde sound collage, outside of listening to an avant-garde piece, it's fine. It's okay. It's also a bit demo-y. This was recorded in a hotel room in Canada, so also very unpolished, which was their style at the time, I suppose. One thing that you may have heard is that the guitar picking during the, I guess you could call it the bridge or the instrumental break, very reminiscent of Sun King.
Oh, I didn't hear that, actually.
Give it another listen. You'll hear it, and I've seen other people point it out as well. And this was recorded a fair bit before Abbey Road and the Sun King.
Yeah, I think it's a pleasant little song. I actually don't mind Yoko's vocals, really. The more and more I hear it, the more and more I get used to it.
Yoko's vocals on Remember Love are very sweet, very, very pleasant. I have no issue with them. I think most people wouldn't. When people are talking about Yoko's vocals and having issue with them, they're talking about the, for lack of a better term, screeching or yodeling that she does during the album. I've seen Pitchfork described her vocals during the album as proto-punk. Perhaps that's true.
No, I actually get what they're saying, because what this recording was, and I think one thing that's interesting, like this and Trout Mask Replica we read up earlier, is the DIY aspect of where I can hear this, I feel like I could make this. And I think that's one thing that we're going to see going forward with some art, like some artists, like especially in the British punk scene. The progressive rock scene is going to become really big in the early 70s. But then there's so many excesses of it. Then you get the punk music, which is stripped down, garage rock,
Right.
and like just very simplistic, which is not a problem. But I think that DIY aspect of it is very proto-punk because it's like we don't care how it sounds. It's out there. The art is out there, and that's what matters. Is putting something out. And I think that's why it also sounds pro-punk. No, I think musically, I think it's a very pleasant song, and yeah. It doesn't have like the shredding guitars, but I think it works.
Just a nice little acoustic piece.
Mhm.
Very few objections to it.
One thing that's nice about the Beatles here is that at least we have something different to talk about with the Beatles, because oftentimes I think a lot of people just think that the Beatles exist and then everything else they make sounds exactly like the Beatles. And I think when they try it, but here it's like, no, he's like, I'm going to make something out there, something weird.
It's definitely not boring.
And I'm going to make people listen to it, get them hip.
And I think with that, we're going to close this chapter.
So next, we're going to go to some cool, dry places. We're going to go to a Wilbury Twist and talk about a supergroup known as the Traveling Wilburys. George Harrison's in this group. Who else is in this group? Well, you have to come back and decide. Or you'll have to go listen to it. Look it up. But that's what we're going to next. We're going to Traveling Wilburys Volume 1. And know that we're going to handle this next episode with care. And it'll be a fun time. And I hope you enjoyed hearing about two virgins. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time. If you're interested in hearing more, please give us a follow, give us a like, comment, tell your friends. It helps us out a lot. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
We always will be.